What Victorian marriage was really like. It's worse than you think. You're standing in a London parlor, 1857. The curtains are drawn, though it's midday. A woman sits perfectly still in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the street below. She hasn't moved in 3 hours. She's waiting. Not for a visitor. Before we go any deeper, I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, from over 150 years ago, can reach people across every continent, every time zone, still demanding to be understood. This isn't a story about one woman. It's about millions of them, living under a system so legally and socially entrenched that historians now call it civil death. When a Victorian woman married, she ceased to be a person in the eyes of the law. Her property became his. Her earnings became his. Her body became his. Even her children, if she bore them, legally belonged to him alone. The doctrine had a name: coverture. And it didn't just shape marriage, it suffocated it, crushed it, turned what should have been partnership into a kind of lawful captivity that makes modern minds recoil. But here's the part that should disturb you more. Most people at the time didn't see it as oppression. They saw it as order, as natural, as divine. Let's go back to that parlor. Her name was Caroline Norton, poet, novelist, granddaughter of the famous playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. By the standards of her class, she should have been untouchable. But in 1836, her husband, George Norton, a jealous, violent man who resented her success, did something that revealed the full brutality of Victorian marriage law. He accused her of adultery with the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. The accusation was false. The trial collapsed. But George Norton won anyway. Why? Because even though Caroline was innocent, even though the court dismissed the case, her husband still had absolute legal control over her. He took her children. He took the money she earned from her writing. He refused her access to her sons for years. And there was nothing she could do. Because under coverture, a married woman had no legal right to her children, no right to her income, no right to divorce, unless she could prove not just adultery, but adultery combined with cruelty, incest, or bigamy. A man could divorce his wife for infidelity alone. A woman had to prove her husband was a monster in multiple documented ways. And even then, even if she succeeded, she'd lose her children. Always. Caroline Norton spent the next decade writing pamphlets, pleading with Parliament, exposing the law's gendered cruelty in language so precise and furious that politicians could no longer ignore it. Her words didn't just argue, they shamed. "I exist only as a legal fiction," she wrote. "I have no rights, no existence, no legal name. I am simply covered by my husband." But let's pull back. Let's understand how deep this ran. In 1840s England, if a woman worked, whether as a governess, a factory hand, or a successful author like Caroline, every penny she earned legally belonged to her husband. He could drink it, gamble it, burn it. He could refuse to give her a single shilling for food or clothing, and the law would back him. If she tried to open a bank account in her own name, the bank would refuse. If she inherited money from her parents, it passed instantly to her husband. If she ran away, he could have her forcibly returned and any constable would assist him. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue. She could not testify in court in most cases. If her husband beat her, unless the violence was extreme and publicly witnessed, magistrates would tell her to go home and be a better wife. And if she became pregnant? If she gave birth? The child was his, legally, from the first breath. If the marriage dissolved, if she fled abuse, she had no custody rights. None. A man could be an alcoholic, a debtor, a known abuser, and still retain full custody of his children simply because he was the father. There are records, heartbreaking records of women who tried to resist. In 1840, a woman named Martha Clark left her husband after years of beatings. She took her infant daughter and moved in with her parents. Her husband tracked her down, broke into the house, and took the child. Martha went to court. The judge ruled in the husband's favor. The law was clear. The child belonged to him. It didn't matter that he'd never fed her, never held her, never even wanted her. She was his property. Another woman, a wealthy heiress named Frances Power Cobb, wrote in 1868 about what she called wife torture, the routine, casual brutality that working-class women endured in marriages they could not escape. Husbands who kicked their wives in the stomach while pregnant, who burned them with pokers, who broke their bones and raped them with legal impunity, because marital rape was not a crime. It wouldn't be a crime in England until 1991. Read that again. 1991. Cobb's pamphlets circulated among reformers, but they barely dented public opinion. The prevailing belief, reinforced by law, religion, and medical opinion, was that women were naturally inferior, emotionally unstable, intellectually weak, and in need of male governance. Marriage wasn't oppression, it was protection. A husband's control wasn't cruelty, it was responsibility. Even Queen Victoria, who reigned over this entire system, resisted efforts to expand women's rights. She called the women's suffrage movement mad, wicked folly. She believed women were meant to be subordinate. And yet, Victoria herself wielded more power than any man in England. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble her. But for women without crowns, without wealth, without famous relatives, marriage was a trap with no exit. Consider the wedding itself. The ceremony wasn't romantic, it was transactional. A Victorian bride was given away by her father, a phrase that wasn't metaphorical, it was legal transfer. The father handed over ownership to the husband. During the vows, the bride promised to obey. The groom did not. She vowed submission. He vowed protection. But protection, in practice, meant control. The marriage certificate was less a partnership agreement and more a deed of transfer. On the wedding night, many brides had no idea what to expect. Sex education didn't exist. Mothers rarely explained. Medical manuals advised women to endure their marital duties without complaint. Some doctors recommended women think of England, or recite prayers, or simply close their eyes and wait for it to end. Pleasure, for a wife, was considered unladylike. Desire was pathologized. If a woman enjoyed sex, Victorian medical texts literally classified her as mentally ill, suffering from nymphomania or hysteria, and if she didn't become pregnant quickly, the blame was always hers. Infertility was a wife's failing, even though Victorian men fathered children with mistresses and servants all the time. If a woman couldn't produce an heir, her husband could humiliate her publicly, ignore her privately, or simply take a mistress and dare her to complain. She had no recourse. Divorce required an act of Parliament until 1857, and even after the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act passed, it remained expensive, scandalous, and almost always denied to women. But here's where the story gets darker. Some women tried to escape through death. Suicide rates among married women in Victorian England were significantly higher than among unmarried women. Drowning was common. Poison, too. There are coroner's reports, cold, bureaucratic, that list cause of death as melancholia or temporary insanity. But the context is often the same. A young wife, isolated, brutalized, with no legal or social escape, who walked into a river or drank laudanum and never woke up. Others tried to kill their husbands. In 1849, a woman named Mary Ann Brough poisoned her husband with arsenic after years of abuse. She was caught, tried, and hanged. The judge showed no sympathy. She had violated the sacred bond of marriage. The fact that her husband had beaten her, starved her, and threatened to kill her was irrelevant. She was the criminal. He was the victim. Yet there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when the system cracked. Caroline Norton's tireless advocacy led to the Infant Custody Act of 1839, which allowed mothers to petition for custody of children under 7 if they could prove they were of good character. It was a tiny conditional victory, but it was something. Later, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce slightly more accessible, though still wildly unequal. And in 1870, the Married Women's Property Act finally allowed women to keep their own earnings. Not their inherited wealth, not their property, just their wages. It was a beginning, but these reforms came slowly, grudgingly, only after decades of women writing, speaking, organizing, and shaming Parliament into action. And even then, coverture wasn't fully abolished in England until 1882. In some parts of the British Empire, elements of it lingered into the 20th century. Think about that. Women who were born under coverture could have lived to see the moon landing. Now imagine the emotional toll. Imagine being told from childhood that your purpose is marriage, that your value is your virtue, that your happiness is your husband's approval. Imagine being raised to believe you are less intelligent, less rational, less capable than men, and then entering a legal system that codifies that belief into law. Imagine loving someone, trusting someone, binding your life to theirs, and discovering that you've signed away your existence. Some women internalized it. They became enforcers of the same system that oppressed them, policing other women's behavior, shaming those who resisted, clinging to the idea that submission was noble. Others broke, and a few, just a few, fought. Caroline Norton never stopped. Even after her husband died and she finally regained some autonomy, she continued writing, pushing, demanding justice for women who'd come after her. She didn't live to see full equality. She didn't even live to see women vote. But she saw the cracks widen. She saw the law begin slowly to recognize that married women were human beings, and yet the psychological damage ran deep. Victorian marriage didn't just control women's bodies and property. It controlled their sense of self. It taught them that love and submission were the same thing, that suffering was virtue, that silence was grace. There's a letter, archived in the British Library, written by a woman named Elizabeth in 1873. She's writing to her sister, and she describes her marriage in careful, restrained language. She never uses the word unhappy. She never complains outright. But between the lines you can see it, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet desperation. She writes, "I have learned to want nothing. It is easier that way." That sentence should haunt us, because it wasn't just about legal reform. It was about what those laws did to the human heart. They taught women to shrink, to erase themselves, to become so small, so silent, so still, that they could survive inside the cage without constantly feeling the bars. And here's the final bitter irony. Victorian society romanticized marriage. Poets wrote about it. Novelists idealized it. The culture worshipped the image of the devoted wife, the angel in the house, the woman who sacrificed everything for her family. They built an entire mythology around marriage as the highest calling, the ultimate fulfillment for a woman. But the reality was that marriage for most women meant the legal annihilation of their personhood. It meant losing their name, their money, their children, their freedom. It meant being trapped in a system that called their suffering love. Some of them survived it. Some of them even found moments of happiness within it, carving out small spaces of autonomy, small acts of resistance. But they shouldn't have had to. The woman in the parlor, the one who sat by the window waiting for permission, she's not a metaphor. She's millions of women, real women, women whose names we'll never know, whose letters were burned, whose stories were silenced. Women who lived and died under a system that told them they were loved when really they were owned. And the worst part? They were taught to be grateful for it.